Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. We are very lucky. This is Dr. Joseph von Nessen, and he's joining us as a lecturer today. So we're going to simulate as we talked about, a press conference where this, as Dr. Van Nessen does, he gives these presentations to the press. Usually in January at the Colonial Life Center there. He's a research economist at Darla Moore School of Business, and he works on economic research and analysis. And when he speaks, it's news. So that he does applied economic analysis, and by that it means what things that industries can act on. Things like remember we read that timber story when we first started out. That was Dr. Van Nessen's baby in that story. So we are really lucky to have him here. If you ask questions, as I hope you will, it's being recorded for us so we can also refer to it. Speak up, okay? So, did I get your intro right?
That all sounds
okay,
right.
thank you for being, thank you.
No, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. It's great to be here. Again, my name is Joey von Nessen. I'm a research economist over in the Darla Moore School. And I like to describe what we do as so what economics. Kind of a shorthand term. I use that term half jokingly when I talk about what we do, but always to make a serious point that we're looking at economic data and asking the question, so what? How can you use economic data to help businesses and organizations make good strategic decisions? And what economic data does the public need to be aware of to stay informed about changes in the economy and potential changes? Right, so very apt description, I think, certainly of what you all are looking at, is trying to understand the economy and understand the important concepts that the public needs to be made aware of. So what we're going to talk about today is the outlook for South Carolina's economy and to a certain extent for the U.S. as well for 2025. We'll go through some trends of economic changes that we've seen in South Carolina over the last few years, where we are today on March 20th, and what our expectations are as we move forward. Okay, so we'll talk about the past, where we are now, and what that tells us about what we can expect and what we can think about for the second half of the year. So, if we start out, there's one word that we can use to describe where we are today in terms of the economic landscape in South Carolina and the U.S. And depending on how closely you're tracking economic data, this may resonate with you. Uncertainty. A lot of uncertainty this year at the national level and in South Carolina that's really emerged. Now why? Why is the outlook more uncertain this year than it was, say, 12 months ago? One reason is because we have a new political administration that has come in, and they're making some changes at the national level from a policy perspective. And that's creating some uncertainty about how that's going to impact the plans of businesses going forward, specifically with respect to tariffs. So you're all following the tariff, kind of the back and forth on tariff policy. So we don't know where that's going to land yet, but in the meantime, until we do know where that lands, if you're a business and you're thinking about the future, especially if you're let's say a manufacturer, manufacturing is when you're looking to manufacture a complex product, you typically need years of lead time when you're trying to make specific decisions about production. And so you want to know what your cost structure is going to be like. And so if tariffs can potentially change what that cost structure looks like, either in a good way or a bad way, then that's going to impact the type of decision that you need to make. So during this period of back and forth, many businesses are kind of stepping back and just kind of pausing. So we're just going to wait and see how this shakes out, see what the tariff policy is likely to be, and then we'll make a decision about how to proceed. There are other factors as well going into the uncertainty that we'll talk about, but that's certainly something that you hear a lot about. And again, it's a very straightforward reason that uncertainty tends to breed paralysis in the business community. It just causes them to step back and wait and see. So uncertainty is a theme that we've seen emerge in 2025. So how do we get a handle on this then in terms of our outlook? Well, I'd suggest to you that when you're thinking about the state and the national economy, we can really break it down and trying to evaluate it into three basic components. Okay, so we can think about economic perception. Just how do you feel about how the economy is doing? How do Americans feel about how the economy is doing? Performance, how is the economy actually doing if we use more objective metrics, and then what are our expectations about the future. And in many instances, these three tend to agree with one another. But that has not been the case in the last several years, and it continues not to be the case in 2025, especially with respect to the differences between consumer perception and economic performance. Okay, so let's talk about each one of these, and this will help inform us about how we can think about the future and expectations for the rest of the year. So let's start with economic perception. How do people feel about the economy right now? Well, I'll give you a two-word answer: not good. Not good. Consumers are very pessimistic. That is not new for 2025. That's been the case for the last several years. And we can see this very easily if we look at consumer confidence. So this is a metric that you'll see used a lot in the media. It's quoted a lot in the media, and it's a frequently used metric by economists and others to just gauge the sense of consumer sentiment, just how they feel about what's going on. And you can see consumer sentiment has come down significantly since 2020, since the onset of the pandemic, right? Not a whole lot of surprise there, of course. We went through a recession in 2020, right? And we've been recovering ever since. But consumer sentiment has remained low, despite the fact that the economy has been recovering. And we're still well below where we were before the onset of the pandemic in December of 2019. And we've seen some back and forth. Consumer sentiment has come down a little bit in 2025, as you can see in the last couple of data points on the right, because of some of the new uncertainty that's emerged. But nothing that is outside kind of the norm of what we've seen over the last several years, right? So consumer sentiment is very poor. And we can track that and compare it against other metrics, namely consumer spending. And this sets up an interesting question, because if consumer sentiment is down, consumer confidence, which you see in orange here, so that's the same picture we just looked at, we can compare that to consumer spending. So what are consumers actually doing, right? So consumer confidence, that's what consumers say. Consumer spending, that's what they're doing, right? How much are they actually spending? And if you look at that, tells you a very different story, right? So consumers say that they're not feeling very good about the economy, but their spending activity suggests that they're doing okay, right? We clearly see the pullback in consumer spending in 2020, right, during the pandemic recession, but it bounces back and has been fairly stable ever since. And so you step back and you say, well, that's weird. What's going on? Why are those so two different? It seems a bit of a paradox. Well, one reason, and perhaps the main reason, is because of the rise in inflation that we've seen over the last several years. And we all know that we've seen prices rise, right? This is something that's happened across the country. It's something that nobody can escape, right? Rising inflation. And it turns out, when we dig a little bit deeper into the data, that consumers really dislike inflation. And what's interesting here, and I've kind of given the story away, but if you look at the change in consumer confidence, note that the biggest decrease in consumer confidence actually took place at the time we saw the biggest increase in inflation. So consumer confidence drops as prices rise. But what's really striking about that is that we saw a bigger decline in consumer confidence in 2021 and 2022 than we did in 2020, when everything was shut down, when we had a pandemic that was generating all kinds of uncertainty and fear. So that seems a little odd, but what that tells us is that consumers really dislike rising prices, because that impacts their budget and impacts their financial well-being, and has very practical implications for their everyday lives. So a lot of what we're seeing here is the fact that even though they're spending, they are seeing rising prices, and that creates a very poor sentiment overall on behalf of the consumer, or on the part of the consumer. But it doesn't answer the question, though, fully, because if we're seeing prices rise, how can it be the case that consumers are continuing to spend, right? If prices go up, don't you normally cut back, right? Because you can't afford as much. So what's going on there? So how can it be the case that we're still seeing an increase in prices? Well, one reason is because it's not all of America, not all households that are driving the bulk of the spending activity. So we can scratch beneath the surface and actually look at spending. This just looks at retail spending, but this is a proxy for total spending. And it breaks it down by income group, by household income level. So inflation started going up in about May of 2021. So when you look at the growth rate here, what do you notice? If we have three groups here, there's really only one group that's been driving the bulk of that growth in spending throughout the entire period since inflation started going up, right? That's that group in green, so these higher income households. Now, in certain periods we see growth for the middle and lower income households, but the bulk of the growth has been coming from just this one segment of American households. What percentage of American households does that represent? Turns out it's about 35%, roughly a third. So what this tells us is that consumer spending that's been fairly steady has been driven by only about a third of American households. The other two have actually seen some pullback, or at least they're not seeing growth at the rate that they were back in 2021. And these are the two groups, this 2/3 of the population, that's driving that poor consumer sentiment. Does that make sense? Because they're the ones that are most affected by rising prices. So they're cutting back, they're seeing poor sentiment, whereas the bulk of the spending is being driven by this group. So that's how you can resolve this apparent contradiction where you see very low consumer confidence, and yet consumer spending is continuing on. That's very important. Why? Because consumer spending is the biggest factor that drives our economy. So it's important to understand why consumer spending is either changing or not changing and what drives it. Because that can help inform us, or help inform our thinking about where the economy is headed. So let's go through a quick example just to illustrate how prices have changed. So if we look at the overall inflation rate, and we just look at that in terms of groceries, $100 in groceries in December of 2019. So I want you to take a guess and tell me, how much do you think $100 in groceries would cost today? If you bought the same items that would have cost you $100 at Food Lion or Publix or wherever in December of 2019, how much would those same groceries cost you today? Any guesses? $2.20. $2.20. Okay.
$1.50.
$1.50.
$1.70.
$1.70. Okay, prices haven't risen quite that much, fortunately. About $129. But still by a lot. Still by a lot. All right, so that is your new number. Now tell me how much you think prices would have gone up if we had not had the pandemic and the surge in inflation. So $100 in December of 19, up to $129 by January. What do we think it would have been otherwise?
Maybe 150?
115. Any others?
110.
110. Okay, I think you got, you're pretty close. Closest without going over. 112. 112. So this just gives you a sense of what consumers are seeing, right? Because everybody goes to the grocery store, right? All the time. So constantly, when you see prices rise, consumers are constantly, these price increases are being reinforced, right? When they go to the grocery store, or when they're buying things online, or when they are filling up their car at the gas pump. And there's actually a technical term for some of these. We can look at $71 in May of 2004 as well, so looking backwards. But, say about this technical term, the difference between what prices would have been and what they are, we call that group frustration level, and that's a very real thing, right? Because that's what consumers are, what they're experiencing. So you can just see how these prices change, and you can just think about how you would feel as seeing these prices rise over time, especially when you compare that to wage growth when you're working. And so let's do that. Let's do that comparison. So that's the bad news, that prices have been rising. But the good news is that we have seen some changes in inflation in the last year, and wages are continuing to rise as well. And so from, again, if you think about a consumer sentiment perspective and we think about purchasing power, it's important not just to look at how prices are rising, but how wages are rising too. Right? Because if we don't want prices to go up, but if your wages are rising faster, it's not quite as bad. Right? So we want to compare the two. So we can look at inflation in red and average hourly earnings in green. And so what you can see is that inflation has gone up, it's come back down, it's about 2.8% today, but wages are growing at about 4%. And this has been happening for about the last year or so, where we're seeing wages grow faster than prices. So what does that mean? It means that even though prices have risen, consumers have lost purchasing power, but they're beginning to claw it back, because wages are rising faster than prices again. So we're moving back in the right direction. They haven't clawed all of that lost purchasing power back yet. So on average, consumers are still worse off today from a purchasing power perspective than they were in 2019. But we're beginning to move in the right direction again because wages are rising faster than prices. So it's important not to just look at prices by themselves, but also to put it into context with purchasing power and compare them to overall wage growth. All right, so let's change gears then and talk a little bit more about economic performance. So we've talked about perception, how consumers feel about the economy. We've said that there's a lot of uncertainty in the business community. We've said that consumers are feeling pretty bad. We've measured that through consumer confidence, and we've said that's mainly because of inflation, these rising prices. We've seen examples of how that has been taking place over the last several years, but we've also seen that consumer spending has remained fairly steady because of household spending, particularly among upper income households. And we've seen that wage growth has picked up in the last year or so. So it's beginning to offset some of those losses in purchasing power. Now, how does that compare then to economic performance itself, if we look at broader measures of the economy? Well, I would suggest to you that if we're looking just at an overall performance of the South Carolina and US economies right now, we'd actually grade it pretty well. And I'd suggest that we can give it a grade of a B+. So, why B+? What's going well with the economy? Well, economic growth has remained steady. We've seen that in terms of steady consumer spending, right? We just looked at those data. That has continued into 2025. We have a historically low unemployment rate in South Carolina, and across the US, the labor market remains relatively strong. And wage growth has been fairly strong, as we just talked about, right? 4% wage growth compared to inflation at 2.8. So consumers are clawing back some of that lost purchasing power. So by most metrics, the economy today is performing fairly well, with the major exception of that loss in purchasing power that we've talked about. Consumers have lost significant purchasing power since 2019. So that's really why we give it a B+ instead of an A. Okay? The other factor is that in the last year, labor markets have cooled a bit. And we'll talk about why that's the case. But overall, the economy remains in fairly good shape in 2025. The other factor, when we're looking at the performance of the economy today, is that we're entering what I would call a new era. We're moving away from a pandemic bubble that we've been in and towards more sustainable growth rates. Now, why is that the case? Because this pandemic bubble represents a surge in demand that took place in 2020 and 2021 following the pandemic recession, where we saw a rapid labor market recovery and $6 trillion in fiscal stimulus in 2020 and 2021. And those dollars were accessible to most consumers, to American households. If you remember the stimulus checks, your households had that, get those stimulus checks, remember? A lot of households had access to various tax credits, enhanced unemployment insurance benefits for a period of time. So there were a lot of ways that households were able to tap into these $6 trillion in stimulus. And they were able to spend those dollars, and that generated a pandemic bubble. Red hot demand, right? They're spending this money in the economy. And when you have high demand, what does that do? Puts upward pressure on prices, right? And that generated that high inflation. And so now we've been readjusting ever since. We've been coming down off of that pandemic bubble. We've been deflating that bubble. And we're now to the point where we're moving into a period where we can see more sustainable growth rates now that that bubble is fully deflated. And so in a real sense, we've been in recovery mode for the last several years as this pandemic bubble has been deflating. And a very good way to see that is for us to just compare two recoveries, the last two recoveries that we've seen from the economic recessions in the United States. So we can look at the Great Recession from 2008. So this was the last recession that the US experienced before the pandemic. And of course the COVID pandemic in 2020, the COVID recession. So we can compare directly the recovery rates, and you can just look at inflation, and you can look at the recovery of employment in green. And so what you'll notice here, if you look at the recovery track, is that, as we point out here, it took us about 7 years to recover all the lost jobs in South Carolina after the 2008 recession. That's a pretty long time, right? A significant recession, we lose about 8% of the total employment base in South Carolina. And it takes us 7 years to recover those jobs. Very slow recovery. In 2020, it takes barely 2 years. And you say, man, that's way better, right? Clearly we did something much better in terms of our recovery. So what was it? What was the difference here? Well, it took us 2 years instead of 7. Well, that's true, but in order to get a much faster recovery, what do we have to do? We have to stimulate the economy. And so this is the result, in part, of that $6 trillion in stimulus, right, that generated high levels of demand and created a faster employment recovery. So you might say, well, clearly this recovery was better because it was faster, but remember the consequence of stimulating the economy so much. Red hot demand leads to rising prices. And so one of the things that we teach in economics is that policies come with trade-offs, right? You heard the concept, there's no such thing as a free lunch, right? In economics, that's what we're talking about here. So we can say, yeah, we recovered much faster from an employment perspective. That's great. But what was the price we had to pay for it? Was the high inflation that we've been experiencing over the last few years. So there's a trade-off there. And as a country, for better or worse, we decided that we wanted a faster employment recovery, and we were willing to trade off higher prices for that. And so that's the difference. So we've really been recovering because even though we've recovered all the lost jobs, we've still been recovering from that level of high inflation. Because inflation peaked in 2022, and it's been coming down ever since. So that's another factor at play. So you have to think about multiple factors when looking at these recovery processes. All right, and then another way that we can look at the durable or the pandemic bubble is to focus on the goods and the services market. So this is a very easy way to see what we're talking about with this pandemic bubble. And so we can take these consumer spending data that I showed you before, right? It's been fairly steady. But when we scratch beneath the surface, you can see a very different pattern emerges if we look at the goods market and the services market separately. And you can clearly see that goods bubble, right? You see it peak and then begins to taper. And in 2024, just in the last year, for the first time, we've gotten back to pre-pandemic trends. Now, why was it a goods bubble? Why did it surge here, but we didn't surge in the service sector? What's going on there? Why is that so different? Any guesses? So what's different about buying goods versus buying services, especially in 2020 and 2021?
You couldn't see people face to face.
Exactly. We were all socially distanced. So were we going out to eat? No. We certainly weren't getting on an airplane, right? We were staying home, remodeling our houses, buying furniture and exercise equipment and all that good stuff, right? But we were at home. So exactly, we were socially distanced. So all those dollars were spent in this chunk of the economy right here, in this sector of the economy, the goods sector. So as a result, the goods sector has been correcting over the last few years. That bubble has been deflating. So if you are a business in the goods sector, then you are going to be you will have seen a very different economic climate in the last couple of years than if you've been in the services sector. For example, in South Carolina, the housing market. If you follow housing market trends, one of the things that you'll see is that housing sales growth has been either flat or slightly negative for the last 2 years. Why? Because they're part of the goods market and it's been pulling back. It's been correcting. In contrast, the tourism sector, leisure and hospitality, has had some of its best years in its history in South Carolina because the service sector has been very strong. After this period of social distancing, the service sector is recovering. So the pendulum really swung towards the goods market, and now it's kind of swinging back to pre-pandemic norms. So if you know this difference between what you're seeing in the goods and the services sector, that helps explain some of the industry trends that we've seen in individual sectors in South Carolina. And we can actually see this very clearly in some of the different sectors. I alluded to housing already. Manufacturing is another one. So this looks at, this is national data, a national metric that is the ISM Purchasing Managers Index. Again, this is a frequently cited statistic documenting manufacturing activity in the United States. And it looks at things like production levels, employment levels, inventory levels. And anything above 50 represents expansion in the sector. Anything below 50 represents contraction. So if you step back, can you see the durable goods bubble? It's pretty obvious, right? So this is the manufacturing component of it. So that goods bubble that peaked and has been correcting helps explain some changes that we're seeing in the manufacturing sector. That's true nationally. It's also true in South Carolina. We have a major manufacturing sector in our state. The automotive industry, major driver for South Carolina's economy. Is anyone taking the BMW tour in Spartanburg? If you have a chance, you ought to do it. It's pretty cool. And we were talking before. There's a neat video. I'll share it with you so you can send it to everyone of robots, humanoid robots that are now operating on the plant floor at BMW. It's pretty cool. A little scary, but pretty cool too. So manufacturing, very important for South Carolina. We can look at the South Carolina port down in Charleston. What is the purpose of the port? To export and import different goods and materials. So they're exporting BMWs, among other vehicles, out of South Carolina to markets like Europe and China. They're also importing a lot of materials and final goods to distribute to consumers for their business customers. And again, if you look at growth rates for pure container volume, and you step back and you squint a little bit, can you see the durable goods bubble here? And you should be able to, right? So again, very straightforward trends. So that goods bubble shows up in most sectors. It's not subtle. So some of these pandemic trends have had major impacts on different regions of the state. So here's the automotive industry. Here's the durable goods bubble. Here it doesn't quite show up as much because we've got such a weird scale here because the global supply chain constraints, especially with the chip shortage, which you may remember in 2021, created a bit of a disjointed graph here. But you can still see in general the spike and then the pullback overall in demand. So again, the durable goods bubble. And then finally, oops, went the wrong way there. We can see it in the housing market, which I alluded to before. This looks at growth just in South Carolina this time. Again, 0% here, the black line. So you can see negative growth in 2022 going into 2023. And just in recent months have we finally seen that durable goods bubble fully deflate. And again, that has implications as we look forward, because what it says is that if you're in the goods sector, you've been going through this correction period, but as we transition from a pandemic bubble to more sustainable rates of growth, we may see positive growth in these sectors for the first time in several years in certain cases. So it's very different. We've had a very bifurcated economy over the last few years in terms of breaking it down between the goods market and the services sector. What about the labor market? Turns out we can say something similar when we look at employment trends as well. So here, we can look at the unemployment rate. We can start by just getting a sense of what the labor market looks like in South Carolina and at the US level. And if we look at unemployment rates, the most commonly cited metric, again in the news typically, we can look at how the unemployment rate has changed in South Carolina and in the US over the last year. So 3.4% to 4.4, 3.7 to 4.1, that's a little disconcerting on the surface, right? Because you look at that and say, all right, well, especially in South Carolina, the unemployment rate's up a full percentage point just in a year. Is that concerning? Does that mean that a recession is right around the corner? Is the labor market starting to deteriorate? Well, again, context is important, and I would suggest to you that we are also seeing an adjustment from a pandemic bubble to a more sustainable period of growth in the labor market as well. Because when you see red hot demand, that generates more purchasing activity, but it also generates more demand for labor, right? More workers are needed as businesses are expanding. They're responding to that higher demand. And so over the last year, as we've seen that bubble begin to deflate, so too have we seen the rate of job growth slow. So this is very important when you're looking at labor market trends right now, that unemployment has been rising over the last year, not because we've seen increased layoff activity, but because we're not creating jobs as quickly. A very important difference, very subtle difference, but very important. So the way to think about that in South Carolina is consider that South Carolina has seen very strong population growth over the last decade, and especially in recent years. So people are moving into the state, and many of them, when they move in, are looking for work. And we can see here that we've had slower job growth. So it's taking them longer to find work when they move into the state. And so what do we call someone when they're looking for work? They're unemployed, right? So it's just taking them longer to get absorbed into the labor market. Population growth, the rate of population growth has not changed in the last year in South Carolina. People are still moving to this region of the country, still moving to South Carolina, but we're just not creating jobs as quickly. And so that's putting upward pressure on the unemployment rate. So context, again, very, very important here. And we can see evidence for this as well if we look at the data. So South Carolina employment growth, we can look at trends over time, and you can just compare. What does employment growth look like in South Carolina today to where we were before the pandemic? So in this case, the black line represents the pre-pandemic average annual growth rate in South Carolina. So that pandemic bubble, right, coming out again, very clear, right? High levels of employment growth during 2021, during the peak of that bubble, and then begins to taper off, closer to pre-pandemic norms. And so that has put some upward pressure on the unemployment rate in South Carolina. So unemployment's gone from 3.4 to 4.4. What do you think the average unemployment rate in South Carolina is, historically? It's about 6% during periods of economic expansion. If we throw out all the recessions and just look at periods of economic expansion in South Carolina, going back to the 1970s, the average unemployment rate is 6%. So if you put that in context, now going from 3.4 to 4.4 doesn't seem so bad, right? It seems like we're readjusting to normal. And that's exactly what's happening. So you can see it in the unemployment rate, you can see it in the employment growth trends as well overall. And we can also see it if we look at layoff activity. So we said that it's not because we're not seeing an uptick in the unemployment rate because people are being laid off. How do we actually know that that's the case? We can look at unemployment insurance claims data. This is the best metric that we have. So in South Carolina, when you are laid off from your job, you have the opportunity to file for unemployment insurance benefits. Okay, and to do that, you go to the Department of Employment and Workforce. And when you file for unemployment insurance benefits, the first time you're considered an initial claimant, and you can do it every week for a certain period of time. And so we can actually tally up the number of initial claimants every week. That's public data. And so this gives us a sense of the number of newly laid off people in South Carolina. Now, you've been talking about a lot of large business changes, right, this semester? And so normally, if a major business lays off a lot of workers, we hear about it, right? So that's going to show up in the news. That's going to be something that we see. But when small and medium-sized businesses lay workers off, that doesn't show up as often. But we can still track it. And that's really important. This is actually one of our best leading indicators for where the labor market is headed. Because it tells us in close to real time, these data come out weekly, so they tell us in virtually real time whether or not employers are beginning to lay workers off, particularly among small and medium-sized firms, which represent the bulk of business activity in South Carolina. So if you're looking for a leading indicator on the labor market, this is a good one to use, especially when we're going through major changes in the economy and you're concerned about changes or anticipating changes either in a positive or a negative direction. This gives us some insight there. But again, the bottom line is we're seeing a labor market that is tapering and that is moving away from a pandemic bubble and more towards sustainable levels of overall activity. All right, let's go to point number 3 then, economic expectations. So we've talked about perception, we've talked about performance, and now we want to talk about expectations. What can we say about the future given that consumers don't feel particularly good about the economy? But as we've seen, most metrics show that we're doing pretty well. B+ economy overall. Yes, we've seen high inflation, we've seen a loss in purchasing power, but we are also readjusting towards more sustainable rates of growth coming off of this pandemic bubble. And most metrics are looking pretty good. Consumer spending is looking strong, the labor market is still strong, wage growth has been strong. So what does this imply about the future? What can we say about 2025? So here are the primary factors that we need to be looking at. Now we're thinking exclusively about the future. Consumer spending, the strength of the labor market, and inflation and interest rates. So 3 things that we've already talked about previously, but we want to now evaluate how these are likely to change going forward based on some of the trends that we're seeing in 2025. So you should already know some of the answers to these in terms of where we are, but what factors are going to change them going forward? That's important to talk about as well. So let's go through each one in turn. First, let's talk about consumer spending. We said that was fairly strong. We've already looked at those data. But what predicts consumer spending? What predicts consumer spending? Well, the amount of money that you have, ultimately. And so in economics, we tend to measure that by what we call disposable personal income. So this is just a measure of income for households after they take care of regular expenses, mainly shelter, mainly housing. So disposable personal income, what does that look like? What does the growth rate look like for disposable income? Well, this peaked in 2021 as well. So again, this bubble shows up, and we've seen it begin to taper. So high growth in disposable income, then consumers spend it, and their disposable income goes down, and now we've kind of leveled off back to pre-pandemic norms. So if we're looking at disposable income growth as a predictor of future consumer spending, what we can see is that we're still in pretty good shape, suggesting more sustainable growth for 2025. So consumer spending still looks like it's on a fairly stable track overall. at least so far. If we look at the labor market, do we expect to see any changes this year? We've talked about that tapering, right, as we've seen a slowdown in job growth. That also manifests itself in the number of job openings. Another leading indicator that we can track. The job openings rate, just the number of positions that are currently open and unfilled. Right? So you can see that peak in 2021 and 22, and that begins to correct as well. Notice also, again, we're back to these pre-pandemic norms. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that we've been in a correction mode, but that we don't have a whole lot of wiggle room left either. Right? Because we're back to where we were. So, if we have a major economic shock this year, then there's less wiggle room to weather that. So the economy, from a labor market perspective, remains strong. But again, we just don't have as much flexibility as arguably we did a year or 2 years ago, because we've come down off of this pandemic bubble. And that makes a difference when we think about where we're headed next. So the consumer, along with the job market, both remain in relatively good shape, but we can't cool too much further. Again, we're trying to get a sense of what's ahead. Are we going to go into a recession? Is the economy going to heat up, or is it going to cool down? We've seen it cooling down over the last couple of years. It seems to be stabilizing, but again, because we're back to pre-pandemic trends, pre-pandemic norms, not a whole lot of further wiggle room. So we're on the lookout now for any slowdown beyond where we are right now, because that can make a meaningful difference. All right, and then the third piece, we can look at inflation. Remember before we talked about consumer spending, we talked about the labor market, and now we want to talk about inflation and interest rates. Okay, another factor for where we're headed. And this becomes even more important. And this, I would argue, that this is the most important single factor that can drive our economy this year and can affect whether we potentially see a slowdown in growth this year. So first of all, let's just look at the overall trends. Now remember, what is inflation? Inflation is nothing more than a measure of the rate at which prices are changing. Okay, so all this is measuring is how quickly prices are rising in the American economy. Right? This affects everybody. So you can see the rate of price increases before the pandemic. You can see that it's been about 2% overall. It jumped to 9% in 2022. It's come back down to about 3%, and it's kind of settled in there, right? So this doesn't mean that prices have come down. This means that prices are rising at 3% per year today, whereas they were rising at 9.1% back in 2022. So prices are still rising, just not as quickly. And we've also seen that wages are now rising faster than prices. So inflation has come down quite a bit. But it has settled in at this rate of about 3% or so. And the question is why? What's been driving this change? What's driving the decline in inflation from 9% to 3%? And why is it kind of stalled out at 3%? And will it continue to go down closer to this 2% level where we were before the pandemic? Or is it going to stay where it is? Well, we can look at inflation in a bit more detail to get some insight on that. So we can break inflation down into the goods market and the services market, just as we did with consumer spending. And so if we do that, we can take a look and say, well, all right, how does inflation look from this perspective? So red here represents the services sector, and the shades of blue represent the goods market. So we can look at durable and non-durable goods. And so if 2% is our inflation target, that's where we were before the pandemic, how close are we? Well, in the goods market, things are looking pretty good, right? We're back. Why have we seen a pullback in inflation in the goods sector? It's just been part of that correction, right? That pullback in the goods bubble that we talked about before. So again, you can see that durable goods bubble and really non-durable goods bubble as well in the inflation data. It's the service sector that's driving inflation now. That's where it's still significantly elevated above 2%. That's the missing piece. That's why we have inflation that's really stuck. It's the service sector. What is it in the service sector? There are a couple of factors that are driving that. So what is the what's contained in the service sector that might be keeping upward pressure on prices or prices from coming down? There's one big factor in the service sector that the goods sector doesn't have that keeps prices elevated. You might know what that is? What do businesses have to hire more of when they're producing a service than when they're producing a good? What's the key difference? I think you said it. People, you got it. Labor, right? When wages go up, when hourly rates go up, do they typically come back down? Not really. If you get a raise at your job, and then your employer comes back and says, hey, you know what? We're gonna lower your hourly rate now. How often does that happen? Usually does it, right? So wages, what economists typically say is wages are sticky. Right? Once wages go up, they stay up. So we are also in a period where we are experiencing a labor shortage, and so wages are growing, and we've seen that, and that's actually good news for workers. But it can also keep inflation higher than where we want it. So again, remember there are trade-offs there. So the service sector, there's a very specific reason why we've seen inflation stay above that 2% target, and it has to do with the components that are driving the sector of the economy. But there are other factors as well. It's not just the labor shortage, not just the lack of labor. There are other things, and I say that there are many factors fighting the Fed, meaning the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve, one of their goals is to get inflation to this 2% level. That is their target. They've been very clear about that. And so we want to look at what factors are preventing them from getting inflation down. The labor shortage is one. Strong consumer spending is another. Consumer spending is great for demand. It keeps our economy growing, but it can also put upward pressure on prices. Remember, high demand tends to raise prices. We've seen elevated shipping costs over the last couple of years. We've seen high housing prices because of a lack of inventory. And we don't have time to go through each one of these individually, but I'd be happy to talk about some of the factors that are going into driving each one of these if you have specific questions. But I just want to illustrate to you that there are a lot of factors right now that continue to put upward pressure on prices or to keep prices at their current level. New tariffs is another one. The potential for new tariffs in 2025. And again, we're seeing a lot of back and forth in that with the Trump administration, and we don't know where that's going to land yet. So this is an important factor, but it's not the only one. Right? There are a lot of factors here that can potentially put upward pressure on prices and lead to inflation going back up this year. And it only takes one or two of these to move the needle on inflation. And that could have an impact on our outlook. Why? Because if prices go up, that causes, in general, consumers to cut back on spending. And it's more likely to do that when consumers are already struggling from price increases. Right? They're already pessimistic. We've seen that in the data. They've lost purchasing power since 2019. If inflation goes back up for any of these reasons, it means that consumers are going to be more financially squeezed, and thus it increases the likelihood that they can cut back on spending. And that could impact our outlook for growth and whether or not we see a recession this year. So these are all very important factors to take a look at. And so to give you an example, this is similar to what we did before with prices, but this time we want to compare the growth in inflation to growth in earnings in a slightly different way. So this time let's start in May of 2020, and let's just do a simple exercise and look at the total growth in prices, total growth in inflation, and compare that to the total growth in earnings. Okay, so just how much higher are prices today compared to 2020, and how much higher are wages? So we've already talked about how consumers have lost purchasing power, and so that's what this measurement is here. So you can actually see the difference. So here's the question. If we continue to see wages grow at 4%, the same level, indefinitely, and we continue to see prices rise at 2.8% per year, where we talked about inflation being at about 2.8. When will these lines cross? That's what we want to see. We want consumers to get all that purchasing power back. So when will the green line be above the red line again? Well, it depends on inflation, but if inflation continues at 2.8%, then we can do that calculation and purchasing power will be recovered by October of 2027. Okay, so that's not any time particularly soon. But what if we bump inflation down to 2.0%? What if we get inflation down to where the Fed wants it, where it was before the pandemic? Instead of October 2027, now we're talking about September 2026. That's a pretty big difference. And when you're thinking about consumer spending, that is a really significant number. Right? That can make the difference between whether consumers pull back and by how much, and you can see it changes the rate at which they're recapturing that lost purchasing power. So the point here is that small changes in inflation can have big differences in how quickly consumers get their purchasing power back. So it's really important to be tracking what inflation does this year, because that can have a meaningful impact on spending activity, and that can impact our outlook for 2025. So inflation has a chance of going back up this year because, again, as I mentioned before, it only takes one or two of these factors to move the needle on inflation. And if we do see inflation go back up, that can lead to a slowdown in economic growth. So this is the biggest wild card for the outlook for 2025. This is the biggest unknown. Will inflation go back up this year? And I think there's a decent chance that it will, a significant chance that it could go up this year. All right, and then finally, let's talk just a little bit about tariffs. Again, another topic that's really in the news these days. And why do tariffs matter? For the purposes of our discussion, the reason tariffs matter is because they can put upward pressure on prices, at least in the short run, and they can move the needle on inflation. So it's important to understand how that's likely to impact inflation, because that can in turn impact consumer spending this year. So what do we know and what do we not know? Well, what is a tariff? What is a tariff? At the end of the day, a tariff is nothing more than a tax. It's a tax on consumers when they're purchasing goods from overseas, from abroad. Because all a tariff does is it increases the price of any good that's being purchased from overseas. So that can have an impact either directly or indirectly. So if a consumer buys a product from a foreign company located overseas, then they would pay more directly. Or if a consumer, a US consumer, purchased a good from an American producer, American manufacturer, let's say, but that American manufacturer has to use foreign inputs to manufacture that product, then the business, that manufacturer, is going to be paying more for those inputs, and it's possible for them to pass that along to the consumer. And if they do, the consumer pays more. All right, so a tariff is a tax on consumers, so it tends to raise the prices for goods in the American economy. Not every good, of course, but the goods that are specifically impacted by the tariffs. But at the same time, there are also benefits as well. So it raises prices for consumers, but it can also incentivize businesses to relocate into the United States, and can also benefit businesses that are already here. Why? Because if you're a company operating in the US and your main competition is a company in Europe or in China, and your customers can buy your product more cheaply from them, then if you create a tariff, all of a sudden you're going to have more consumers that are going to look to you, right? Because your prices are going to be more equalized. So that can benefit a business or an industry that the tariff is trying to target. And if that business grows, then they can hire more, they can pay more, and that can support their local community. Does that make sense? So there are costs and benefits associated with tariffs. That's what we know. And it's important to distinguish the economics of tariffs, which acknowledges these costs and benefits, from the politics. What is the politics of tariffs all about? The politics asks the question or makes a statement, you know what, the benefits are better than the costs. Or you know what, the costs the benefits do not outweigh the costs, rather. So you can go in either direction. So the politics is when you're trying to answer which one of these is greater, or whether one is worth it. And the economics is just acknowledging the reality of both and trying to measure that. Right? And every tariff is going to be different. The benefits may outweigh the costs, they may not, and it depends on who you ask. If you ask a consumer, they may have a different answer than if you ask a particular business. Right? So very different questions here, whether we're talking about economics or whether we're talking about politics. Now, what do we not know about tariffs? Turns out a lot. Turns out a lot. So all these different questions, we're still trying to sort out. And a lot of the back and forth with the new administration is leading to speculation about where we'll land on some of these questions. So who will the tariffs impact? Well, it depends on what products they apply to. It depends on whether they're actually going to be used at all. Maybe it's the case that most of these tariffs are just threats to be used as negotiation for other policies. When will they be implemented? For how long? What about retaliatory tariffs? What's a retaliatory tariff? Anybody know? What's retaliatory?
Another country responds with a tariff.
Exactly. Other countries respond. So if we put a tax on their imports, they put a tax on ours. And so that can lead to further changes, further impacts on businesses. So if you're a business, like if you're a South Carolina export-oriented manufacturer, which many of our manufacturers are, and you're selling to Europe and you're selling to China, and they put a retaliatory tariff on products that you're selling, that impacts the demand, right? And so that impacts your business activity, right? So that's an important consideration too. Will public opinion affect implementation? Well, we've seen a major correction in the stock market already in 2025 because of a lot of the back and forth. So it looks like we're stabilizing at our new level, but that could affect what we decide to do as a country in terms of the implementation of tariffs. We don't know. So a lot of unknowns right now. Again, that gets back to our initial point, which is that there's a lot of uncertainty in 2025. But these are all things that you need to be thinking about when you're writing about tariffs and thinking about tariffs and their impact on the outlook this year. So things we know and a lot that we still don't know. All right, so let's wrap up, and then I'll be happy to take any questions, and we can go into any details about any factors that we kind of glossed over. But when we look for 2025, what can we say? What's the bottom line in terms of our outlook? Well, as we said, South Carolina's economy remains strong. Right? We graded it at a B+ level because consumer spending remains steady. We have historically low unemployment. We have strong wage growth. The biggest weakness, though, is that loss in purchasing power. Right? That is the weak spot of our economy right now. Consumers, on average, are still worse off today from a purchasing power standpoint than they were in 2019, before the pandemic began. It's a major weakness. So, given that inflation may tick back up this year, and there's a significant chance that we think that it will because of all the factors that we talked about, remember, only one or two of them are needed to change to move the needle on inflation. So there's a significant chance that inflation could rebound. So that makes it the biggest short-run economic threat for this year, because that could reduce growth in consumer spending, particularly given that consumers have already lost a lot of purchasing power. They're clawing it back now because wages are growing faster than inflation. But if inflation goes back up, then we're going to either lose some of that progress or slow it. Right? And that could potentially slow consumer spending and slow the U.S. economy. So that's the biggest risk factor. And then finally, are we going to see a recession this year? I'd suggest to you that the probability is below 50%. Again, because the economy remains in fairly good shape overall. But the biggest risk factor here, again, is that inflation can go up. And because we have moved away from the pandemic bubble and towards more sustainable rates of growth, it means we can't handle a shock as well or significant pullback in demand beyond what we've seen already. So there's just not as much wiggle room left, which is why the probability of recession is a bit higher this year than it was last year. But again, the economy is still in fairly good shape, so I'd suggest to you it's less than 50%. But at the end of the day, when all is said and done, I think it's likely that growth in 2025 will be slower than in 2024. Again, because of that pandemic bubble that we pulled back from and the uncertainty. And if you were following the Federal Reserve comments this week coming from Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell, he echoed similar sentiments. And the Fed has basically said that growth, which was around 2.4% GDP growth, over 2% in 2024. Now the expectation is that growth will slow to probably around 1.5% or so in 2025. Why do they expect that growth to slow? For these reasons right here. Again, we're moving away from the pandemic bubble, and there's a lot more uncertainty that's creating some businesses to move more into wait and see mode. So we're cautiously optimistic for the year, but still some risk factors. All right, so I will stop there, and I think we have a little bit of time left. So are there any questions I can answer for you? We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of material, and a lot of different data. Yes, ma'am?
If tariffs were implemented, how would it affect the purchasing power of consumers?
Great question. If tariffs were implemented, how would it impact the purchasing power of consumers? So overall, for the U.S., we would typically see purchasing power loss because it would raise prices. But it also depends on the nature of the tariff, and it can also depend on the region. But overall, tariffs at the end of the day, they raise prices for consumers on the goods that they're targeting. So to give you an example, this isn't the case now, but about a month ago there were proposed tariffs on agricultural products coming out of Mexico and Canada as well. The U.S. imports a lot of agricultural products from Mexico, and about 17% of our food in the United States is imported. So if you translate that into a trip to the grocery store, what that would mean is if you're going to, let's say you have 10 items and you're going to the 10 item or less checkout, on average, the average consumer who does that, probably one or two of their items is going to be imported, which means a tariff on agricultural products would affect probably one or two of their items on their grocery list. So it does have an impact, but it's specific to those sectors. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about a little bit before how there's more people moving to South Carolina now. And I'm from New York, so I came down to South Carolina. I know there's a lot of people from New York.
So Charleston looks cheap to you. It looks cheap to people from South Carolina, yeah.
A lot of people from the North, New York, New Jersey area come down to South Carolina. Students, young people, young families, in search of lower property taxes and warmer weather, right? Partly because they're able to take their corporate jobs online. You're able to do remote a whole lot more often recently. So I think my question is, do you think that this switch over to more remote work will destroy the big cities because of a decrease in infrastructure potentially and a decrease in consumer spending in those areas also?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with the advent of working from home, is that going to have a destructive impact on larger cities as people tend to move away? I would say it will change the nature of work, and really already has. It's not going to, I don't think it's going to destroy cities, but it will change migration patterns that, as you're alluding to. A lot of what we've seen is a movement away from cities into the surrounding suburbs, because what companies have done, they've kind of, after the social distancing norms relaxed a little bit, we went from a period where companies were allowing fully remote work to where they shifted the pendulum back, and it's more of a hybrid environment, 2-3 days a week. And we don't know if that's where we're going to land long term or not, but it's looking increasingly like that based on business surveys and trying to just establish new norms with workers. And so if that's the case, then the increase in demand within these suburbs makes more sense because you're not having to travel to the office quite as often. So I think that's part of what's going on. But in certain industries, working from home 5 days a week has still become the norm, so it really depends on the industry as well. So that's what we're seeing. And in South Carolina, to your point about people moving to the south, that trend has increased since 2020 exactly for that reason, that more people do have the option to either work hybrid or work fully remote. And so that's increasing the attractiveness of places like the South. Southeast is projected to see more growth than any other region of the country over the next 30 years. And I don't see anything that's going to change that trend. So that's a good question. Good question. Okay, yes, ma'am.
So, based on all this information you've given us, what is the biggest piece of financial advice you would give to consumers this year?
Financial advice.
Or any kind of advice really to interpret this information?
So from a financial standpoint, I'd say that you want to, when you're thinking about retirement and investing, you want to invest consistently. And you want to look at investments as over the long run, not over the short run. And so one of the things we can say with the stock market is that it tends to go up over time because American business does well over the long run. So if you are investing, you need to think about investing for the long run, not investing your money today, wanting to withdraw it next year. So I think the bottom line is you want to think about for the long haul and not be worried about short run fluctuations. And if you're if you're saving money that you're going to need in the short run, you shouldn't be investing it. So I'd say in general from an investment perspective, that's the single best piece of advice that I think fits regardless of what the economic outlook is. Yes, sir.
If someone is working remotely for a company in, say, New York, but they live in South Carolina, are they employed in New York or South Carolina?
That is a good question. So if someone is employed remotely in a different state, where do they count as being employed? So there are two, they are counted as employed officially where the business is. And that raises a very good question that economists and data analysts are still trying to figure out, which is how we capture remote workers. So if you are located, if you're, let's say you're working in New York for a New York firm, you live in South Carolina, the New York firm is going to count you as an employee because they're located there. So in these employment records we're talking about, New York counts you, or South Carolina will count you even if you're working from California. And so then what happens when you're looking at a situation, if you take an extreme example where, okay, well, most of our companies, let's say in South Carolina, hypothetical, most of our companies all of a sudden have completely remote work environments. And so the average company, only 25% of its payroll is living in state. That makes a big difference because now, if you're thinking about it from an economic development perspective, you don't necessarily care as much about the companies, you want the people, right? So it completely changes your strategy for economic development. So in terms of measurement, that's still a challenge in terms of how we can track what that percentage looks like, but that's a really good question, and it brings up broader, long-run questions about economic development, about whether we want the businesses or whether we want to focus more on creating an environment where the people will be knowing that they're going to be working from anywhere. So that's a very good question. We don't have an answer for that yet.
Would a trade war with Canada, like a tariff war, do you think that would be good or bad for the South Carolina economy?
So a trade war, you're talking about escalating tariffs over time. That on net is not going to be a positive outcome for the state or the U.S. economy, because that's going to put broad increases on prices. But you have to look at the individual industry as well to see if there are going to be certain winners. Because again, tariffs tend to benefit the sectors that they target, or can benefit the sectors that they target. So it really depends on the nature of the tariffs. So it's hard to say with certainty there. Which again, another reason why uncertainty is the key theme here, because we really don't know where these tariffs are going to land. how long they're going to last and whether they're going to have a real impact on certain industries or not, and to what extent we'll see any types of benefits or costs. But on average, again, the bottom line when we look at tariffs is that when you look at it from an aggregate perspective at the U.S. level, economists have found historically that the increase in prices to consumers tends to outweigh the benefits to the businesses that the tariffs target. So overall, we tend to see a reduction in economic growth when tariffs are implemented at a broad level for the U.S. as a whole. Not to say there aren't individual winners, but for the U.S. as a whole, that tends to be the general conclusion. Yes, ma'am.
So like, how would you compare, I guess maybe South Carolina, like our economic, you said we were B+, how would you compare us to maybe like North Carolina or Georgia? Like, are we doing better, are we doing worse?
So how does South Carolina's economy compare to other states? Compared to the U.S. overall, we do pretty well, do better than average, and most metrics, South Carolina has actually done better than the U.S. average. That's typically true for overall growth rates. It tends to be true for the labor market as well. The Southeast tends to also do better, so if we compare South Carolina to North Carolina or Georgia, those are also economies that have done fairly well. And part of that is because we're seeing more industry growth. Part of it is we're seeing more population growth. People are moving to this region of the country. So as we look forward, I think you're going to see more economic growth. As a percentage of the U.S., you're going to see more of its economic growth come from the Southeast over the next 10 to 20 years. We're seeing an increasing migration to this region and more economic activity.
So
Yeah, go ahead.
I've been keeping up with our current administration and just the economic plan that's going about there and some of the comments on it. I just wanted to know like what your opinion is on our current administration's economic plan and what you think like is going to be the result of all of these changes being made, and also how do you feel like public perception is going to play into these policies?
Yeah, great question. So what what is the overall outlook and impact of the Trump administration, and kind of what is public perception on it? So I would say there are really two sides in general to two components of the administration's economic policies. One is, we'll call it the tariff side and the tax side. So the tariffs are being used potentially for two reasons. One, for negotiation with other non-economic factors like fentanyl and other things that they're trying to impact. And then for non-economic reasons. Then you got it for the economic reasons, where they're actually trying to generate more manufacturing investment in the U.S. And what is the impact of that going to be? Again, uncertain, but likely to, in the short run, increase uncertainty and potentially increase inflation. So that is going to have, on net, likely a negative impact on growth. And we're already seeing that in terms of growth projections being revised downwards this year because of that. On the tax side, however, the main goal, at least from what they have said so far from the administration, is that they want to extend the tax cut package that was originally passed back in 2017, 2018. And if that happens, if that becomes their priority, that can lead to stronger growth next year in 2026. Because if they pass it this year, it would be 2026 before we see any impacts there, especially if they extend it. Increase tax cuts in any piece of that legislation. But that would impact it in 2026 as opposed to 2025. So from an economic growth perspective, I think that's what we have to look at. So tariffs, at least in the short run, probably move the needle in a negative direction. If they focus more on tax policy, probably going to move it more in a positive direction, particularly beginning in 2026.
Do you feel like that's going to be positive for everyone, or just that higher income?
It will depend on, it can potentially impact everybody, but it really depends on it is going to depend on the individual groups, how that's applied. And if business tax cuts or business tax policy changes as well, that can also impact individuals. But you have to look at the impact on the individuals and on the businesses to really make that decision.
Well, thank you for coming. We're out of time, but I will be quite interested in your drafts of this. I heard a theme at the end, and typically we lead with themes when we write. So this will be posted online, the video and all the slides to help you refer back as you write. Writers, it's important that they turn around their product quickly. So we're going to have these drafts due really fast. So you've seen the schedule online. So one of the issues in journalism is
I thought you were going to say an hour.
no, get it right and get it fast. So and then we'll move on. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Very, very